Here is the evidence we're going to look at for the rest of the video, starting with Pope Innocent in the midst of the North African Councils, and then moving on to the decree of Gelasius. From there, we'll see how prominent Protestant historians concede that the African Code, which contains the Catholic biblical canon, was incorporated into the canon law of the Universal Church, East and West, by the late 6th century at the latest, with solid evidence of its translation into Greek and usage in the East even earlier by mid-6th century. While the evidence is more speculative before the mid-6th century, earlier usage in the East, including at ecumenical councils, is plausible, considering the meteoric rise of the authority of Augustine in the East. The Council of Constantinople III in 681 provides another milestone on the way to the most explicit embrace of the African Code and its canons at the Council of Trullo in the East. We'll then wrap up the evidence with the ecumenical councils of Nicaea II and Florence. I want you to notice the evidence here includes 3 ecumenical councils and 3 popes and spans multiple centuries, soon after the African councils were held. Every century from the 5th through 8th centuries. Considering that the judgments of Rome had always been binding on the Universal Church, Pope Innocent is the first earliest piece of evidence of the universal reception of the biblical canon decreed at the North African Councils. His letter to Bishop Exuperius of Toulouse in 405 AD provided a biblical canon that is an exact match to that of the North African Councils, though he doesn't appear to mention those councils explicitly. But he does send other letters to African bishops, and at least one of those letters seems to approve of 2 of the African synods generally and affirm their value for all the churches throughout the whole world. While the major focus of these synods and letters are to condemn Pelagianism, they also include and affirm the Catholic biblical canon, which includes the deuterocanonical books. I realize some Protestants may see this merely as evidence that the biblical canon of the North African councils was only affirmed in the West. But this is already quite the concession, and we're just getting started with the evidence. For those Protestants who doubt that the canon of the North African councils was ever more than just local, regional, or Western, in F. Bruce's book, The Canon of Scripture, he admits that the North African biblical canon represented the general consensus of the churches of the West and of the greater part of the East. He also says that these were the very first church councils to make a formal pronouncement on the canon, and that these councils did not impose any innovation on the churches. The next piece of evidence for the universal acceptance of the Catholic biblical canon, as found in the North African councils, comes from the 5th century decree of Gelasius, which says, "Now indeed the issue of the divine scriptures must be discussed, which the universal Catholic Church receives, or which it is required to avoid." And then it goes on to list the canonical books of the North African councils, including the Deuterocanon. While not explicitly mentioning the North African Council specifically, it gives a list of canonical books that matches up exactly with the canon of the North African Councils. Again, Gelasius refers to the canon which the universal Catholic Church receives. Not just Africa, not just Rome, but the whole church. And I've provided the Latin below for those who are interested in it. Protestant historians like Philip Schaff admit that the African Code, which included the Catholic Biblical Canon, was always in greatest repute in all the churches next after the Code of the Universal Church, and that these canons of the African councils were inserted into the ancient code both of the Eastern and Western churches. Again, this is Protestant affirmation and testimony to the universal acceptance of these North African councils, which would include their biblical canon. Here we see Charles Mounier in his modern critical edition of the canons and acts of the African councils say, among the documents of the law of the ancient churches, the canons of the African councils hold no small place. He goes on to say that Latin copies were translated into Greek and were admitted into the sources of Byzantium law, pointing to the Council of Trullo as an example. Schaff and company also affirm that the canons of the North African councils were translated into Greek, but are uncertain about when exactly the translation happened. They say certainly before the Council of Trullo in 692 AD, which accepted and confirmed the canons, but like Charles Mounier, don't go any further than that. But German scholar and evangelical Lutheran pastor Heinz Ohme can apparently do better than Schaff and points out that there is good evidence Justinian had Greek copies of the North African Code by about the year 550 AD. Justinian wrote a letter that contains a verbatim citation of Canon 81 from the African Code. At the very least, the entire body of African canons shows up in the Greek canonical collections toward the end of the 6th century in a document called the Syntagma 14 Titulorum. This evidence paves the way for further authoritative affirmations of the North African Code and its biblical canon at the ecumenical councils of Constantinople III in 681 and Nicaea II in 787, as well as the Eastern Council of Trullo in 692.